Hello students, Michigan here with Chapter 24, Lesson 4 is called World War I Brings Change. So today's lesson is mostly about how the war ended and what happened as a result. There's also a whole section on the Russian Revolution and the rise of the communists. Why is this important? Well, as we'll learn very soon, the world after World War II was dominated by the two biggest kids on the block, the USA and Russia. The bulwark of communist Russia that is born in this lesson would not die until 1991, which isn't very long ago. The geopolitical climate of the whole world, of your parents and your grandparents, was forged by the rivalry between what is going to be born today in Russia and the United States. So we're starting to have long-lasting effects that are relevant to our lives. But before we get to Russia, let's talk about the end of World War I. So we left off with the Germans sinking 4 U.S. vessels with their undersea boots. Between that and the intercepted letter to Mexico, remember being like, hey Mexico, if you join us, we'll give you back the land you lost in the war 50 years ago. So the U.S. is basically, it's ready to throw down. And throwing down is what the USA did. The Allied and Central Powers, essentially, their soldiers were tired. They'd been fighting for years in those trenches. About the same time the U.S. was joining the fight, Russia was leaving the fight, which we'll talk about shortly. So the Germans didn't have to fight the war on the Eastern and the Western Front anymore. So they moved their forces that had been fighting the Russians back to the Western front against Britain and France. Now this would have been a disaster for the Allied powers, but this is the same time the U.S. forces arrived, so they were able to help the Allied forces repel an attack on Paris and then push back, and they broke the German lines. Now Austria-Hungary was on the verge of collapse and the Ottoman Turks surrendered. Uh-oh, not a lot of Central Powers left. Then revolts in Germany forced the Emperor of Germany to step down, and they were forced to sign an armistice, which is like a peace treaty. That was November 11th, 1918, ending what they called the Great War, or the War to End All Wars. So November 11th is Armistice Day, and now it's still Armistice Day, but also Veterans Day. Okay, effects of the war. Now, to say war is hell is cliche and not very illuminating, but I will tell you that the suffering of a single individual as a result of war is something that I wouldn't want for any of you. Pain of losing a son, undoubtedly by violent means, be it gas or bayonet, is mind-warping. That was someone's husband, on any side, or someone's baby raised from birth, with love, gone forever in violent warfare. 9 million soldiers died. 21 million were wounded, and 13 million civilians died. Farms and homes were destroyed all throughout Europe. The Ottomans had their own, they had a minority population in their country called the Armenians, and they thought that the Armenians were supporting the Allied powers, and so Austria-Hungary, or the Ottomans rather, were a central power, and so they systematically killed hundreds of thousands of Armenians, which is the first modern genocide, or killing of an ethnic group specifically, because they are an ethnic group. Genocide is something that will happen again in history, but the Armenian genocide by the Ottomans are sort of the first modern example of genocide. Now, peace talks. In January 1919, peace talks began in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. There were some big names present, like President Woodrow Wilson was there, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was there, Premier Clemenceau of France, and don't forget Italian Prime Minister Orlando. Wilson presented a plan called the 14 Points, which said national groups should have their own nation, so like the Armenians should have their own nation. Basically, remember like in the Balkans, there were all those ethnic groups. They thought, all right, we have all these different groups of people kind of scrunched together in these artificial nations. Let's give them each their own nation. Self-rule was what they were trying to accomplish. It also called for the creation of an organization called the League of Nations, which would be all the nations working together to prevent future wars, sort of an international organization. Now, the Treaty of Versailles ended up creating the League of Nations, but Woodrow Wilson actually couldn't get the Senate to approve it, so the U.S. wasn't part of this League of Nations. Now, it wasn't approved because treaties have to be approved by the Senate, and the U.S. Senate didn't want the USA getting caught up in foreign wars. They didn't want to be obligated as members of this league to go to war in European affairs that wasn't really their business. Remember, we were kind of isolationists. We had these isolationist tendencies, just stay neutral, let what's going on over there happen, and we're staying out of it. So that's kind of why the senators did that. So that was a pretty unique situation. Also, the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to surrender territory as well as limit their military severely. So they're like, you guys started this war, you can't have very much of a military anymore. Also, they had to pay reparations, which are basically paying damages to other countries in Europe. Like, hey, you started this war and now you have to pay us for it. Essentially, damages. Germany got the short end of the stick on this, and I mean, they were the losers. But some people say that the League of Nations was too harsh on Germany, and that's what led to World War II. We'll argue about that maybe in the next chapter. What else happened? A lot of maps were redrawn in Europe. Borders of Europe were redrawn with, as I mentioned, self-government in mind. The idea was to give national groups their own country. Austria-Hungary disappeared, basically being turned into multiple new states, with chunks of it being absorbed into already existing nations. Germany and Russia lost land. Now, the problem with the borders drawn at Versailles was they couldn't actually give a country to every single ethnic group. And most countries ended up with two ethnicities, with a majority and a minority population. And this would basically make those countries unstable. Because people would want self-government, and there'd be the big guy picking on the little guy, and it was just going to cause a lot of problems. Now, the Ottoman Empire, part of the Central Powers, was also broken up, and all that remained of the Ottoman Empire was present-day Turkey. But the last of the Ottoman sultans was overthrown by a guy named General Mustafa Kemal, who they call him the father of Turkey. He worked to modernize Turkey and reduce the influence of Islamic religion in their government. So less theocracy, more democracy. The Middle East. Oh boy. The Middle East had belonged to the Ottomans, but was now divided among the member nations of the League of Nations. France controlled Syria and Lebanon. Britain controlled Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. Technically, these new territories run by France and Britain were called mandates, meaning they were kind of really the property of the League of Nations, but they distributed them to France and Britain to run for the League of Nations. Now, the local populations, the Arab populations, had no loyalty to Britain or France or the League of Nations. In 1932, Saudi Arabia was formed when a number of smaller Arab nations united on the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia was initially very poor until the discovery of oil, and now we're still buying oil from Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, over in British-controlled Palestine, you had an arguable two-thirds majority population of Muslims, with one-third of the population being Jews. It depends on what source you look at. Now, Jews had begun to settle in Palestine in the late 1800s. In 1917, Britain issued what was called the Balfour Declaration. Shouldn't be a space there. The Balfour Declaration, promising Jews a homeland in Palestine. The Arabs were super ticked about this, and to basically try to appeal to them and not make them too mad, the British, they limited the Jewish settlement in the area, making more restrictions. There's more to this story, but the short of it is that Jews and Arabs have been fighting in Israel ever since, in Palestine. Alright, there's that mess. Let's talk about another mess, Russia. Russia had fought with the Allies in World War I. They were part of the Allied powers, but they were having big problems at home and pulled out of the war early. Here's why. The people of Russia were not pleased with the Russian ruler, the Tsar. They owned little land, yet paid high taxes. Russia had lost a war with Japan, resulting in the loss of territory and money, and the people all blame this on the Tsar. In 1905, after a big workers' rebellion, the Tsar tried to appease them by setting up a parliament called the Duma, but he didn't really give them any power and ended up having it disbanded when they tried to do something he didn't like. So boom, here comes World War I. Russia's fighting for the Allies, but the Russian industry is subpar. They basically can't keep the troops supplied, and they sure as heck can't keep the people supplied, so you have starvation. There were fuel shortages, there was food shortages for everyone, soldiers, people, all of it. In March 1917. So boom, we're right in it. This is right when the U.S. joins World War I. They've been fighting for years. People flood the streets of St. Petersburg demanding peace and demanding bread. They're starving. The soldiers that were there to defend the government refused to fire on their own people, and the people called for the removal of the Tsar, who did indeed step down, but then was executed along with his whole family. Members of the Duma that had been members of the Duma set up a temporary government, but they were so concerned with the war and continuing to fight the war that they really didn't address any of the issues of the common people, and then they soon lost support. So the people set up these little committees called Soviets to represent their needs and concerns to the Duma. Soon the Soviets were in competition with the government for control, of the country. These groups were socialist, meaning that they wanted workers to create a society based on equality for all, so everything would be distributed equally. Now, the most radical group of these socialists was the Bolsheviks. Their leader was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin believed that they should use violence to bring about change in the country. So the Bolsheviks vowed to take Russia out of the war, distribute the land equally to the working class, and put the Soviets, these committees, in control of the country. In November of 1919, the Bolsheviks basically did that, taking control of the capital with relatively little bloodshed, and Lenin immediately made peace with the Germans, so the communists take over the country, and then they're out of World War I. Not their problem. They've got their own problems. At this point, Russia broke into civil war between Lenin's forces, now called the Communists, also called the Reds, and the people that didn't like them were called the Whites. The Whites vowed to take back control of the country and re-enter Russia into World War I. So civil war now. Lenin's number 2, Leon Trotsky, famous communist, defeated the Whites in 1921, giving the communists control of all of Russia. That is where the lesson ends. That is where the chapter ends. So, study day, test day, that's where we're at. You have your basic 10-point quiz here. 5 questions, 10 points, all about the end of World War I in Russia. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, have a glorious day.